The morning after the storm, a veteran Navy SEAL walked the forest trails behind his cabin with his loyal German Shepherd. The dog moved 10 feet ahead, nose low to the wet earth, reading the damage the way he once read combat zones. Then, near the northern river bend, the dog stopped. Not the casual pause of curiosity. Something deeper. Every muscle, locked ears, rigid nose pointed toward the dark forest across the swollen water. But it was not fear. It was urgency. The same urgency the dog showed every time Colton Mercer was about to break. Every time the nightmares came and the walls of the cabin closed in, and the only thing standing between Colton and the long silence was 70 pounds of fur and loyalty that refused to look away. Something was hidden out there, something that had been waiting 45 years for someone brave enough to find it. Before we continue, tell us where you are watching from. And if stories like this bring you comfort, take a moment to like and subscribe. It means more than you know. Colton Mercer had learned to live without reasons. That was what the mountains taught a man if he stayed long enough. The pines did not ask why he was here. The river did not care what he had done. The silence of northern Montana wrapped around him each morning like cold water, and he let it because silence was the closest thing to forgiveness he had found. He was 46 years old, built like a man the military had used hard and returned incomplete. Broad shoulders that still carried the posture of someone trained to enter rooms where people wanted to kill him. A left knee that ached with every step, the souvenir of shrapnel that the surgeons removed, but the nerve endings never forgot. His face was weathered, the jaw tight, the eyes a pale blue-gray that studied everything twice before trusting it once. He kept his dark hair short out of habit, though silver had begun to claim the temples years earlier than it should have. 5 sentences. That was all anyone needed to understand Colton Mercer. Tall, damaged, quiet, watchful, and alone. He lived in a one-room cabin at the edge of the Flathead National Forest. No television. No neighbors close enough to hear if he shouted in his sleep, which he did most nights. The only furniture that mattered was the bed where the nightmares found him, the chair where he drank coffee before dawn, and the spot on the floor beside the wood stove where Ghost slept with one ear always turned toward his owner. Colton had come to Montana 18 months ago with a duffel bag, a dog, and the understanding that he was not running toward anything. He was running from a name he could not say out loud. A name saved in his phone under a contact he had never once called since arriving. Some mornings he would open the phone, stare at those letters, and then close it again the way a man closes a wound he is not ready to clean. The cabin was supposed to be temporary. A season, maybe 2. Just long enough to stop hearing the explosion every time he closed his eyes. Just long enough to convince himself that the world could exist without Marcus Dunn in it. But seasons passed, and Colton stayed, and the temporary became permanent, the way grief always does when a man refuses to look at it directly. That morning he stepped off the porch into the pale light of a forest still dripping from the night's fury. Every joint protested. The knee sent its familiar electric complaint up through his thigh, and he adjusted his weight automatically, the way he had 10,000 times before. His boots found the muddy trail. The air smelled of torn, pine-soaked earth, and something faintly metallic that storms always left behind as though lightning had a taste. He did not bring a map. He did not need one. He brought Ghost. Ghost moved ahead with the quiet certainty of a creature born for exactly this. The German Shepherd was 6 years old, solidly built with a black and tan coat, still thick enough to turn rain, and a pair of amber-brown eyes that never stopped working. He had served beside Colton as a military K-9 in places where hesitation cost lives and trust was measured in seconds. Retirement had softened neither his instincts nor his devotion. He did not walk like a pet. He walked like a partner. Low nose, relaxed shoulders, weight balanced and ready to shift in any direction. His ears rotated independently, catching sounds Colton would not hear for another 30 seconds. And every few minutes, without breaking stride, he would turn his head just enough to check on the man behind him. A glance. A confirmation. You are still here. Good. Colton knew every version of that posture. The easy patrol pace when nothing stirred. The prey alert stillness when a deer crossed upwind. The danger freeze when something did not belong. The gentle press of a warm skull against Colton's palm when the world inside his head became louder than the world outside it. Ghost had pulled him back more times than Colton could count, not from enemy fire, not from ambush. From the place a man goes when the guilt is louder than the breathing, and the only exit sign is the one that glows in the dark at 3 a.m. Ghost would appear at the edge of the bed, press his body against Colton's legs, and breathe. Slow, steady. Again, again. Until Colton followed the rhythm back to something like the present tense. They did not need a leash. They had never needed one. What held them together was older than obedience and stronger than training. It was the understanding that neither of them had anyone else. So when Ghost stopped that morning near the northern bend of the river, Colton noticed before his own boots settled. The dog did not bark. He did not growl. He simply stood weight forward, head angled toward the thicker forest across the bank. Every line in his body narrowing into a single point of focus. Colton's hand dropped instinctively toward the knife at his belt. Not because he expected danger, because old habits lived longer than the reasons that created them. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Ghost did not look back. That more than anything told Colton it was real. They crossed the river at a narrow gravel break where the water ran shallow and fast over smooth stones. Ghost went first, sure-footed and silent. Colton followed the cold water biting through his boots, his knee complaining with each careful step on the slick rocks. On the far side, the forest changed. The trees grew closer together. The light dimmed. Morning sun filtered through broken clouds in pale shafts that turned the mist into ghostly ribbons between the trunks. The air smelled different here. Not just wet pine and earth, but something older. Like damp stone sealed away from sunlight. Like iron left in rain. Like a room shut for so long the dust itself carried memory. Ghost moved with purpose now, not searching, following. Whatever scent he had caught, it pulled him forward with the quiet insistence of a dog who had already made a decision for both of them. "That's right," Colton muttered. "No vote, just a field trip." If Ghost heard the dry humor, he gave no sign. They pushed through dense undergrowth where thorny brambles reached for fabric and fallen trunks forced them to climb duck and circle. The ground rose, then dipped, then narrowed near a shelf of stone covered in thick moss. Colton crouched and brushed the moss aside. Cut stone, flat-fitted, deliberate. He cleared another patch. A line emerged beneath the green. Old paving stones laid by human hands nearly swallowed whole by roots and decades. Not a deer path, not erosion. A road. Or what had once been one. No map Colton owned showed a road here. Ghost stood farther ahead on the hidden line of stone, turning once as if to make sure Colton was still following. "You're enjoying this," Colton said. The dog blinked, which somehow felt like agreement. They followed the buried road for nearly half a mile. The forest thickened, then opened. The sound of the river, once distant, grew louder again. Steady. Broad. Old. Colton pushed aside a curtain of wet branches and stopped so suddenly the breath left him. Across the water stood a stone bridge. Ancient and impossible. A single massive arch spanning the river, its gray blocks darkened by decades, its sides heavy with moss and vine. And built into the near end of the bridge, attached to it so completely that it seemed born from the same vision, was a small stone house. Not a ruin collapsed into meaninglessness. A house. Its walls were thick, its roof pitched, and old, its narrow windows half veiled in ivy. The entire structure looked as though the forest had tried to erase it and failed. For a long moment, Colton only stared. Ghost walked forward first. His paws made no sound on the old stone approach. He crossed onto the bridge with an ease that tightened something in Colton's chest, as though the dog were not discovering this place at all, as though he were returning to it. That was the moment the feeling changed. Until then, the discovery had been strange. Now it became personal. Colton followed. The bridge held. The stone was slick in places, but solid. Up close, the house revealed its scars. Cracked mortar, warped shutters, a rusted hinge on a narrow wooden door. He stood before that door and felt for reasons he could not name as though he should knock. Instead, he pushed gently. The door opened with a reluctant groan. Inside, the air was cold and stale. Damp wood, old ash stone that had not known warmth in decades. Light fell through the narrow windows in pale strips, revealing a single room with rough floorboards, a broad stone fireplace, and the ghost shapes of furniture long gone. Dust lay over everything like a gray veil. Ghost entered first head low, not fearful, but intent. Colton stepped in behind him. Each floorboard answered with a tired complaint. Then Ghost stopped in the center of the room. He lowered his nose to the floor. One slow sniff. Then another. Then, with sudden urgency, he began clawing at a particular plank. Sharp, deliberate strokes that sent dust skittering through the shafts of light. Not random, not playful, focused. Colton crossed the room in 3 strides and crouched beside him. The plank was older than the others, its edges darker, its nails not matching the rest. Someone had lifted it before. Long ago, maybe. But not by accident. Colton slid the knife from his belt and worked the blade into the seam. The wood resisted, then gave. The plank rose with a dry, splintering sigh. Beneath it was darkness, not deep. Just enough for a narrow hollow between the joists. And inside that hollow, half hidden beneath dust and old cloth, was the corner of a metal box. Colton went very still. Ghost did too. For one suspended moment, man and dog remained side by side in the abandoned heart of a house. No map remembered staring at something that had waited beneath the floor while storms came and went, while roads vanished, while lives broke elsewhere and kept moving. Colton reached into the dark. The box was heavy and cold. Rust had eaten into the edges, but the hinges held. He brushed the lid clean with his thumb and opened it. Inside, wrapped in faded cloth, were several items. The first was a bundle of loose papers, yellowed but preserved. Handwriting. Neat, deliberate strokes in dark ink, faded to brown. A journal. The name on the first page read Thomas Harlan. The early entries spoke about the house, repairs to the chimney, clearing vines from the bridge, watching the river during spring thaw. The steady, methodical notes of a man who valued precision more than poetry. Then the tone changed. The sentences grew shorter, sharper. More trucks today, moving deeper into the North Ridge. That road should not exist. And later, the men running the machines pretend not to see me. Someone told them to. And later, still in handwriting that pressed harder into the page, as though the pen itself were angry, I helped them build this road. I drew the maps. I believed them when they said it would bring jobs to this town. I was wrong. They are not here to harvest timber. They are here to destroy the dam. Colton turned to the last entry he could find. Only one line filled the page. I helped them build the road to destruction. Now I have to be the one to block it. If anyone finds this, look beneath the bridge. Beneath those words, almost as an afterthought, Thomas Harlan had written something smaller, lighter, as though his hand trembled when he put it down. Tell Margaret I tried to come home. Colton read that line 3 times. Then he closed the journal and sat very still while the river flowed beneath the bridge, indifferent and eternal, carrying the forest silence past the stone house and out toward the mountains. Ghost pressed his nose against Colton's hand. One nudge, gentle, insistent. Colton looked down at the dog. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We're not done here, are we?" The town of Alder Ridge sat between 2 long slopes of forest, like a secret the mountains had agreed to keep. One diner, one gas station, one general store that also sold fishing hooks and snow shovels, the kind of place where people measured time by seasons and most conversations ended with a glance toward the weather. Colton parked his truck outside the ranger station late that morning. Ghost jumped down from the passenger seat with quiet confidence and fell into step beside him. People noticed the dog. They always did. There was something unmistakable about a trained K9. The focus in the eyes. The way the animal moved with purpose rather than curiosity. Linnea Frost was bent over a desk when Colton walked in. She looked up with quick, intelligent eyes. She was in her mid-30s, tall enough that people rarely underestimated her, with warm chestnut hair pulled into a low ponytail and the calm focus of someone who did not need to prove anything. She had the reputation of being one of the most competent forest rangers in 3 counties. She also had the reputation of not tolerating nonsense. "Colton Mercer," she said, leaning back. "You don't come into town unless something interesting happens." He set the metal box on her desk and opened it. Linnea's expression shifted immediately. She pulled the papers closer and read in silence. The room went quiet except for the turning of brittle pages. "Thomas Harlan," she murmured. "You know the name." Linnea nodded slowly. She crossed to a tall filing cabinet and pulled open a drawer. After a moment, she found a thin folder and placed it on the desk. "Thomas Harlan," she read aloud. "Former U.S. Army engineer. After the military, he came back here. Family land near the Northern Ridge. Old Stone Bridge property." She looked up at Colton. He filed several complaints in the early 70s. Claimed logging companies were operating outside their permits. She turned another page, then stopped. "Well," she said quietly. "What?" She slid the paper toward him. The report was short. Dated August 1978. Thomas Harlan, missing. No witnesses. No recovered body. Case closed after 6 months. Colton studied the document. 6 months, he said. Linnea leaned forward. Her voice dropped slightly the way it did when she was about to say something she had been thinking for a while. "There's someone you should meet, but I need to warn you first." She paused. "Margaret Harlan is not someone this town treats kindly. Thomas is not a name people here want to remember. Not because he was forgotten, Because they blame him. Blame him for what? For everything. Margaret Harlan's house stood at the quiet end of a gravel road on the edge of Alder Ridge. A small white clapboard structure with a porch that sagged slightly on one side, and a garden that had been tended with the same stubborn devotion for nearly half a century. The paint was peeling but clean. The windows were old but unbroken. And on the porch, a single light burned even in the middle of the day. Linnea parked in front and turned to Colton. Thomas Harlan was the smartest man this town ever produced. Army engineer. When a logging company called Ridgeline Timber came through in the mid-70s promising jobs, Thomas was the one who helped them. He surveyed the routes, drew the maps, designed the roads into the forest. The whole town celebrated. First real economic hope in years. She looked toward the house. Then Thomas discovered what the company actually planned. They weren't just cutting timber. They intended to blast apart the natural rock dam upstream to create artificial floods strong enough to carry massive logs downstream. It would have destroyed the entire valley, the river ecosystem, the farmland, everything. So he turned on them, Colton said. He tried. But the company had already paid advances to half the families in town. Jobs were promised. New businesses opened. When Thomas stood up at a town meeting and said the company was lying, that the forest and the valley were going to be destroyed, Linnea exhaled. Nobody listened. The company told people Thomas was bitter because they refused to pay him more. They turned him into the villain. And the town believed it because believing the company meant believing the money was coming. And then he disappeared. August 1978. No goodbye, no body. 3 years later, the company went bankrupt and left. Roads half finished. Forest partially destroyed. Every promise broken. But instead of realizing Thomas had been right all along, the town blamed him twice. Once for bringing the company in, once for supposedly sabotaging it. Linnea's jaw tightened. Margaret has lived with that for 45 years. Colton looked at the house, at the porch light burning in daylight. She keeps the light on, Linnea said softly. She has never stopped. They walked up the porch steps. Linnea knocked. Footsteps inside. Slow. Careful. The door opened. Margaret Harlan was 74 years old, and she carried those years the way old trees carry weather. Not bent, but marked. Her hair was white, pulled back from a face that had once been beautiful and was now something more. Her eyes were dark brown, deeply set, still sharp with intelligence, but lined with a tiredness that came from decades of grief held in private. She was thin, not frail, but reduced as though the years had slowly been carving away everything that was not essential. She wore a simple blue cardigan over a white blouse, and her hands, when they moved, trembled slightly at the fingertips. She looked at Linnea first, then at Colton, then at Ghost. Ghost did something Colton had never seen him do with a stranger. He walked forward without being called, lowered his head, and sat directly beside Margaret's feet. Not beside Colton, beside her, as though he had identified the source of the deepest pain in the room and chosen it. Margaret looked down at the dog. Her hand rose slowly and rested on the crown of his head. Her fingers trembled against the warm fur. "Thomas had a dog," she said softly. Her voice was steady, but only barely. "A shepherd just like this one. It was his only friend at the end, the only one who didn't turn away." She stroked Ghost's ear once, and something in her face changed. A wall maintained for decades shifted just enough to let light through a crack. Colton reached into his jacket and brought out the journal. "Ma'am," he said, "I found this in a house by the stone bridge. I believe it belonged to your husband." Margaret took the journal with both hands. She opened it. She saw the handwriting. And the wall that had held for 45 years did not break. It did not shatter. It simply opened the way a door opens when someone finally comes home. She pressed the journal against her chest and closed her eyes. No sound, no words. Just a woman holding the handwriting of a man the world had forgotten in a town that had blamed her for loving him. Ghost did not move from her side. The house smelled of lavender soap and old wood and something baked that morning. On the mantel above a small fireplace, Colton noticed a framed photograph. A young couple standing in front of a stone bridge, the man's arm around the woman's waist, both of them squinting into sunlight with the careless confidence of people who believed the future belonged to them. Thomas and Margaret Harlan. Before the company came, before the town turned, before the light on the porch became a vigil instead of a welcome. Beside the photograph sat a coffee mug, faded blue, chipped at the rim. It had not been used in 45 years, but it had been washed and placed back on the same shelf every single day. Colton recognized the ritual. He had his own version of it. The phone number he opened and closed. The name he could not say. We all have our porch lights, he thought. The things we keep burning for people who are never coming back. From behind Margaret, a small face appeared in the hallway. A boy 9 years old with dark hair and wide, watchful eyes. Wyatt. Margaret's grandson, who had come to live with her after his parents' divorce, because no one else could take him. And because Margaret, despite everything, was the only person in his life who had never once given up on anyone. Wyatt did not speak. He watched Colton with the guarded expression of a child who had learned early that adults could not always be trusted. His eyes moved to the journal in his grandmother's hands, to the tears on her face, and then to Ghost. Ghost turned his head. His tail moved once, slowly. An invitation. Wyatt stepped forward. His small hand reached out and touched the fur along Ghost's neck. His fingers sank in, and something in the boy's face softened. Not a smile yet, but the memory of what a smile felt like. Ghost leaned into the touch just slightly the way he did with Colton during the worst nights. It was his way of saying, I know you are hurting. I am not going anywhere. Margaret opened her eyes and saw her grandson touching the dog. The boy she had raised alone in a house the town pretended did not exist, in a life defined by one man's absence and an entire community's silence. And this time the tears came. Not the silent kind she had practiced for decades. Real tears. The kind that come when a person realizes they are no longer completely alone. Colton stood in the doorway of Margaret Harlan's house and understood something he had not expected to understand. He had come to Montana to disappear. He had come to the bridge because a dog led him there. He had come to this house because a ranger pointed the way. But the reason he could not turn around and walk away had nothing to do with a bridge or a journal or a missing man from 1978. It was the porch light. It was the coffee mug. It was a 74-year-old woman who had kept faith with a man the world called a coward and a 9-year-old boy who had no one left to believe in. Colton had not felt this particular weight in 18 months. The weight of mattering to someone. The weight of being needed. It terrified him, because the last time he had carried it, he had dropped it, and Marcus Dunn had paid the price. The general store smelled of coffee sawdust and decades of quiet conversations. Colton found Silas Drummond where Linnea said he would be, near the front window in a wooden chair that had belonged to the building longer than any of the shelves. Silas was 81 years old and looked as though the mountains themselves had carved him. His back curved slightly with age, but his frame remained wiry like old roots that refused to loosen their grip on soil. His pale blue eyes carried the slow patience of a man who had watched the world change too many times to be surprised by anything. "Sit down," Silas said before Colton could introduce himself. He glanced at Ghost. Smart dog. Thinking dog. He looked back at Colton. "You've been up by that bridge." "How did you know?" "Because nobody asks about Thomas Harlan unless they've been up there. And nobody goes up there unless something leads them." Silas leaned forward. "Tell me what you found." Colton told him. The journal, the metal box, the entries about trucks moving at night, the final line about the bridge. Silas was quiet for a long time. Then he spoke, and his voice carried the weight of a man who had held a story inside him for nearly half a century. "Thomas Harlan was the best of us. That's what makes it worse. He came back from the army with skills this town had never seen. When Ridgeline Timber arrived offering contracts, Thomas was the one who said yes. He drew the survey maps. He designed the access roads. He shook hands with the foreman. And we loved him for it. Every family in Alder Ridge saw Thomas Harlan as the man who was going to save this town." Silas paused, his hands folded together in his lap. "Then he found out what they really planned. The rock dam upstream, thousands of years old. Natural formation that holds back the spring floods, keeps the river steady, protects everything downstream. Ridgeline wanted to blast it apart, use the flood surge to push timber down the valley, cheaper than trucks. But the forest would drown. The farms along the river would be gone. Half this town's land would have been underwater. And he tried to stop it," Colton said. "He tried. Lord, he tried. Went to the mayor. Went to every family meeting, every church supper, every gathering he could find. Stood up and told them the company was lying. But the company had already put money in people's pockets. Advance payments, signing bonuses for labor contracts. When Thomas said the money was a trap, people heard a bitter man trying to take their hope away." Silas's voice dropped. "The company sent men around town saying Thomas wanted a bigger cut and got refused, so he was making trouble out of spite. And people believed it, because believing the company meant the jobs were real and the money was coming and the future was bright. Believing Thomas meant admitting they had been fooled. Nobody wants to be the fool," Colton said. "Nobody ever does." Silas looked toward the window. "Thomas tried to send evidence to federal authorities, but the mail went through the post office in town, and nobody knows if those letters ever arrived. He started hiding his proof in the bridge, in the walls of that house, because he was afraid the company or the town itself would destroy it. Then he vanished. August 1978. One night he was there. Next morning gone. No goodbye. No body. The sheriff investigated for 6 months, then closed the case. The official story was that he got lost in the mountains." Silas's pale eyes hardened. "The real story is that people don't vanish over paperwork disputes. The store was quiet. Somewhere outside, a truck passed slowly on the main road. And Margaret?" Colton asked. Silas closed his eyes briefly. "Margaret was 27 when Thomas disappeared. She stayed. She never left this town even when the town decided she was guilty by marriage. Neighbors stopped inviting her to Christmas dinners. Women at church moved to different pews. Kids teased her daughter in school, called her the saboteur's kid. The daughter left at 18 and never really came back. And Margaret just stayed, kept the porch light on, kept his coffee cup on the shelf, kept believing he was coming home even after the rest of us decided he was a coward who ran away. Colton sat with that for a long moment. She kept the light on for 45 years, he said, every single night. Silas looked at him directly. That woman endured more silence than any storm this valley has ever seen. And she did it without once saying a word against the people who turned their backs on her. Ghost, who had been lying quietly beside Colton's chair throughout the conversation, lifted his head and rested it on Silas's knee. The old man looked down. His weathered hand found the dog's head and rested there, trembling slightly. "You know what the worst part is," Silas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I believe them too. For years, I believed Thomas was the problem. I walked past Margaret at the grocery store and looked the other way. I let my silence become her punishment. By the time I understood what had really happened, it was too late to take any of it back. You cannot return 40 years of silence. You can only carry the weight of knowing you added to it." Colton did not respond. There was nothing to say to a confession like that. Some truths were too heavy for words. They could only be witnessed. Ghost kept his head on the old man's knee. Silas stroked the dog's fur slowly, and for a moment the 81-year-old man looked like a boy who had just admitted something he had been holding since before the boy inside him had grown old. "If you are going to do what I think you are going to do," Silas said finally, "you should know something. This town is not cruel. It is afraid of admitting it was wrong, afraid of looking Margaret in the eye and seeing what their silence cost her. Changing their minds about Thomas means changing their minds about themselves. And that is the hardest thing you can ask of anyone." "I'm not asking them to change their minds," Colton said. "I'm asking them to look at the evidence." Silas smiled, thin and tired. "Same thing, son, same thing." Colton left the general store as the afternoon light began to soften over Alder Ridge. Ghost walked beside him through the quiet street past the diner where two women watched from behind the glass with expressions that were not quite hostile, but certainly not welcoming, past the gas station where a man filling his truck glanced at Colton and then deliberately looked away. Word traveled fast in small towns. The stranger asking about Thomas Harlan had already become a topic. Colton felt it. The same subtle shift he had felt in villages overseas when a patrol entered and the air changed. Not danger exactly, but awareness. The town was watching him now, deciding what he was deciding, whether he was a threat to the story they had told themselves for 45 years. Ghost sensed it too. The dog moved slightly closer to Colton's leg, his body relaxed, but his eyes scanning, reading the street the way he once read hostile terrain. Colton returned to the stone house that evening. He sat on the floor with the journal open on his knees, Ghost lying beside him, the last daylight falling through the narrow windows in pale gold strips. He read every page again, this time more slowly, this time looking for what Thomas had hidden between the lines. He found it on a page folded twice and tucked between two others. Unlike the other entries, this one had no date. Just a single paragraph written quickly as though Thomas had little time. "They know I am watching now. If anything happens to me, the proof is not only under the bridge. Part of it is hidden inside the stone walls of this house. everything I gathered, the survey maps I drew for them, the real plans they showed me when they thought I was still loyal, and the plans I drew myself to save what they want to destroy. Colton lowered the page slowly. Ghost lifted his head at the same moment. The dog's gaze moved toward the far wall, toward the broad stone fireplace, and he began walking toward it. The phone call from Linnea came the next morning. The land around the bridge is currently under federal environmental review, she said. But someone has been pushing hard to get it released for private sale. Development permit applications, fast-tracked paperwork, and there's a deadline. If we don't file for historical heritage protection within 3 weeks, the review expires, and the land becomes available. 3 weeks, Colton repeated. 3 weeks? And Colton. There's something else. The town is not going to help us. When people hear the name Thomas Harlan, they don't think of a man who tried to save this valley. They think of the man who brought the company in and then ruined everything. Getting them to support preserving his bridge is going to be like asking them to build a monument to the person they blame for the worst years of their lives. Colton stood on the porch of his cabin looking out at the forest. Ghost sat beside him, leaning slightly against his leg, the way he always did when he sensed Colton was carrying something heavy. "I'm not a politician," Colton said. "I'm not a lawyer. I'm a man with a bad knee and a dog." "Sometimes that's enough," Linnea said. He hung up and looked down at Ghost. The dog looked back with quiet, steady eyes that asked no questions and made no demands. Just present, just there. That afternoon, Colton returned to Margaret's house. She met him at the door with Wyatt standing behind her, one small hand gripping the hem of her cardigan. Ghost went directly to the boy and sat beside him. Wyatt's free hand found the dog's ear and held on. Colton told Margaret about the deadline, about the land review, about the hidden pages in the journal. Margaret listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for what felt like a very long time. Then she reached out and took his hand. Her grip was stronger than he expected. "If you do this," she said, and her voice carried the steady weight of a woman who had waited 45 years for someone to believe her, "you will not just pull the truth out of those walls. You will bring him home. Back to the people who turned their backs on him. Back to the town that let me grieve alone." Colton looked at her hand holding his, at Wyatt gripping Ghost's fur, at the porch light burning behind them in the late afternoon sun. "I'll try," he said. "Trying is how it starts," Margaret said. That night, Colton sat alone in his cabin. Ghost lay on the floor beside the wood stove, his breathing slow and even. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the forest held its breath the way it always did before something changed. Colton opened his phone. The screen glowed in the dark room. He scrolled to the contact he had never called, the name he had not spoken in 18 months. His thumb hovered over the green button. He closed the phone. He looked at Ghost. The dog's eyes were open, watching him in the firelight. "The last time I promised to protect someone," Colton whispered, "he didn't come home." Ghost held his gaze, steady, unblinking. The kind of look that does not argue, or comfort, or explain. The kind that simply says, "I am here. And I am not leaving." Colton set the phone on the table. He leaned back in the chair. He closed his eyes. Outside, the river moved through the dark forest, carrying its ancient patience past the stone bridge, where Thomas Harlan had once hidden the truth, past the town that had chosen to forget him, past the house where Margaret Harlan's porch light burned against the night. 3 weeks. That was all the time left. 3 weeks to find what Thomas had hidden in the walls. 3 weeks to convince a town that the man they had hated for half a century was the one who had tried to save them. 3 weeks to prove that a bridge built of stone and stubbornness deserved to keep standing. Colton did not know if he was strong enough. He did not know if his knee would hold, if his mind would hold, if the grief he carried like shrapnel in his chest would let him stand long enough to finish something for the first time since Marcus. But Ghost was breathing beside him, and Margaret's porch light was burning 2 miles away, and somewhere under the stone and mortar of a house, that time forgot the last words of a man who gave everything to protect a valley that did not want his protection were waiting to be heard. And somewhere in the space between what was lost and what might still be found, a man and his dog sat in the silence together, waiting for morning. The rain came back 3 days later, not the violent kind that had torn open the forest and led Colton to the bridge. This was the slow, patient rain of late autumn in Montana, the kind that fell for hours without stopping and turned the ground soft and the rivers wide and the world into a gray watercolor of itself. Colton stood on the stone bridge that morning and watched the water below. The current had grown stronger overnight, swollen by mountain runoff pushing hard against the old stone foundations with a deep, steady rhythm. Moss that had clung to the lower blocks for decades was being torn away, strip by strip, and the river carried it downstream like green ribbons pulled from a gift no one had opened in 45 years. Ghost stood beside him, nose testing the air. The dog had been restless since dawn, pacing the bridge with a focused energy that Colton recognized from their years together. It was the same energy Ghost showed before a room breach, before a search. Before the moment when something hidden was about to become visible, Colton leaned over the stone railing and studied the base of the bridge where it met the water. The storm had changed the landscape down there. Soil that had packed tight against the foundation for decades was gone now, washed clean by the force of the swollen river. And where the soil had been, something else appeared, a gap. A narrow opening between 2 massive stone blocks just above the waterline. The edges were straight and deliberate, not a crack from age. A doorway built into the bridge itself, sealed by years of mud and moss and the patient accumulation of time. Ghost barked once, sharp, urgent. Then he lowered his head toward the gap and barked again. Colton felt the hair rise on his arms. Thomas Harlan's last journal entry echoed in his mind. If anyone finds this look beneath the bridge. He had been looking at the bridge for days, but he had not been looking beneath it. Not until the rain did the work that 45 years of silence could not. Colton retrieved the rope from his pack. He secured it around one of the heavy iron rings embedded in the bridge railing rings he now realized were not decorative. They were anchors. Thomas had installed them. Thomas had planned for someone to climb down. The descent was slow. The stone was slick with moisture, and Colton's left knee sent a sharp protest through his thigh with every careful step. He found narrow ledges between the massive blocks and used them like a ladder, his boots scraping against wet stone, his hands white on the rope. Ghost watched from above ears forward, body tense, tracking every movement with the intensity of a dog who understood that his person was doing something dangerous. Within a minute, Colton reached the gap. Up close, it was larger than it had appeared from the bridge, wide enough for a man to crawl through. He pulled the flashlight from his pocket and aimed the beam inside. Stone, dust, a hollow chamber extending several feet into the body of the bridge. Colton slid inside. The temperature dropped instantly. The air smelled of damp rock, old metal, and decades of sealed darkness. He crouched carefully and swept the light across the space. The chamber was small, perhaps 6 feet wide and 8 feet deep, formed by thick stone walls that supported the arch above. But someone had used it. There were wooden crates stacked along one wall, their lids half rotted with age. A metal lantern sat on a small ledge, and on the floor, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept it dry through 4 decades of seasons, lay a bundle of papers. Colton knelt beside the bundle and unwrapped it with the care of a man handling something sacred. Documents, dozens of them, typed reports, handwritten notes, folded maps, survey coordinates, dates of blasting tests, diagrams of the natural rock dam that held the river steady, every page bearing the same careful hand he had come to recognize. Thomas Harlan had not just complained. He had built a case, methodically, patiently, with the precision of an engineer who understood that truth without proof was just opinion. Near the bottom of the stack, Colton found 2 sealed envelopes. The first was yellowed with age. The front read simply, "To whoever finds this." He opened it carefully. The letter inside was handwritten. "If you are reading this, then I was not able to finish what I started. The men running the logging operation will destroy this valley if they succeed. They plan to break the rock barrier upstream and flood the river to move timber downstream. I tried to send word to the authorities, but they watch the roads now. I cannot leave the bridge without being followed. If anything happens to me, the evidence here must reach the government. The forest deserves someone willing to stand for it." Below the signature, Thomas had added one more line. "I was part of the problem before I became part of the answer. I drew their maps. I built their roads. That is my sin. But hiding from it would be a greater one." The second envelope was different, smaller. The paper softer, as though it had been held many times before being sealed. On the front, in handwriting that was gentler than the rest, Thomas had written 2 words, "For Margaret." Colton held that envelope for a long time. He did not open it. It was not his to open. Some things belonged only to the people they were written for, and 45 years of waiting did not change that. He tucked both envelopes inside his jacket, gathered the documents into the oilcloth, and turned toward the exit. That was when he heard ghost, not a bark, not a whine. A sharp, urgent sound from above that Colton had heard only a handful of times in 6 years. The sound Ghost made when something was about to go wrong. Colton moved fast. He shoved the document bundle ahead of him and crawled toward the opening. The moment he gripped the outer stone ledge and pulled himself through, Ghost lunged. The dog seized Colton's jacket sleeve in his teeth and wrenched backward with a force that nearly dislocated Colton's shoulder. A crack split the air like a rifle shot. The stone ledge beneath Colton's boots shifted, tilted, and then a section of the bridge's outer edge collapsed. Heavy blocks of ancient stone dropped into the rushing river below with a sound like thunder swallowing itself. Colton fell backward onto the bridge surface, the document bundle clutched against his chest, his heart slamming so hard he could feel it in his teeth. For several seconds, he lay there staring at the sky, at the rain falling into his eyes, at the empty space where solid stone had been 3 seconds ago. If Ghost had not pulled him back at that exact moment, Colton would have fallen with it. The river roared louder now, carrying the debris downstream. Colton sat up slowly. Ghost stood over him, breathing hard but steady. His amber eyes locked on Colton's face with an expression that was not panic and not relief. It was something older than both, It was the look of a creature who had made a choice and would make it again without hesitation every single time for as long as breathing allowed. Colton reached up and placed both hands on the sides of Ghost's face. "Again," he said quietly. "You saved me again." Ghost leaned forward and pressed his forehead against Colton's. They stayed like that for a long moment while the rain fell and the river carried the broken stones away and the bridge stood diminished but undefeated above the water. The words spread through Alder Ridge the way all words spread in small mountain towns. Not through announcements or newspapers or social media, through glances, through conversations that stopped when certain people walked in, through the particular silence that settles over a community when it senses that something buried is about to surface. By the fourth morning, people knew. The stranger with the dog had found something in the old bridge. Documents. Evidence. Thomas Harlan's name was being spoken again in a town that had spent 45 years trying to forget it. Colton did not seek attention. He did not hold a meeting or make a speech. He simply kept working at the bridge with Linnea cataloging documents, photographing pages, preparing the heritage application. Ghost patrolled the perimeter with quiet vigilance while they worked, but people came anyway. The first was Bert Kessler. He arrived on the fifth morning in a battered pickup truck loaded with lumber tools and a temperament that seemed to operate on a frequency somewhere between stubbornness and comedy. He was 58 years old, barrel-chested, with a red face permanently weathered by outdoor work and a voice that carried farther than most people's patience. He parked at the edge of the trail, climbed out, looked at the bridge, looked at Colton, looked at Ghost, and said, "That railing is going to kill somebody before the government gets around to saving it." Colton stared at him. "Who are you?" "Bert. I fix things. Heard you found a mess up here and figured you could use someone who knows which end of a hammer does the hitting." He pulled a hand-painted sign from the bed of his truck and nailed it to a post near the bridge entrance. The sign read, "Dog is foreman. Boss needs a vacation." Ghost tilted his head at the sign. Colton looked at it for a long moment. And then, for the second time since arriving in Montana, he laughed. Not a big laugh, not a loud one, but real. The kind that comes from a place a man thought had gone permanently dry. Bert did not ask about Thomas Harlan. He did not ask about the documents or the heritage application or the politics of a town that could not decide whether to remember or forget. He just started working, measuring the damaged railing, cutting lumber, whistling something tuneless and persistent that somehow made the rain feel less heavy. Ghost approved of Bert almost immediately. The dog positioned himself near the carpenter's work area and watched with the focused attention of a supervisor who took quality control seriously. When Bert dropped a nail, Ghost picked it up in his mouth and carried it back. Bert looked at the dog, looked at the nail, and shook his head. "All right," he said. "You're in charge." The second person to arrive was Linnea, who had been there from the beginning, but whose role had quietly expanded from forest ranger to legal strategist. She spent hours on the phone with federal offices filing paperwork, chasing down historical records, building the case that the stone bridge and its surrounding valley qualified for protected heritage status. She was calm, precise, and relentless in the way that competent people are when they know they are right and are prepared to prove it with documentation. The third was Silas Drummond. The old man did not announce himself. He simply appeared one afternoon, walking slowly up the trail with a thermos of coffee and a face that carried more apology than words could hold. He did not speak to Colton for the first hour. He just sat on a stone near the bridge and watched the work. Late in the day, Wyatt arrived early with a school backpack and a drawing he had made of Ghost. He showed it to Silas. The old man studied the drawing for a long time. His hand trembled slightly as he held the paper. "My boy used to draw," Silas said. His voice was barely there, like wind through dry grass. He drew pictures of the river. He called the sound it made the dragon's song. He was 9 years old. Wyatt looked up at him. "What happened to him?" Silas was quiet for so long that Colton thought he would not answer. Then the old man folded the drawing carefully and handed it back. "The river took him," Silas said. "The current was too strong that spring. He was playing where I told him not to play, and I was not fast enough." The words hung in the air between them. Colton felt them land in his chest like stones dropping into still water. 9 years old. Not fast enough. The same weight he carried for Marcus Silas had carried for his son. For decades longer. Ghost walked over to Silas and lay down at the old man's feet. Silas looked down at the dog. His weathered hand found Ghost's head. And for a moment, the 81-year-old man and the 6-year-old dog shared a silence that needed no translation. Then, late in the afternoon, Margaret arrived with Wyatt. The boy had been asking to see the bridge every day since Colton's first visit to the house. Margaret had resisted the way a woman resists returning to the place where her heart was broken. But Wyatt's persistence and Ghost's absence from his daily life had finally worn through her resistance. They came up the trail slowly, Margaret leaning on her grandson's arm more than she needed to, not because she was weak, because touching him steadied something inside her that had been unsteady for a very long time. Ghost saw them before anyone else. The dog rose from his position near Bert's work area and trotted down the trail to meet them. He went to Wyatt first, pressing his nose into the boy's palm. Wyatt smiled, a real smile this time. Then Ghost moved to Margaret and walked beside her, matching her pace, exactly his shoulder brushing her hip with every step. Margaret stopped at the edge of the bridge. She stood there looking at the stone structure her husband had built his life around, the place he had guarded and hidden his truth inside, and her face held an expression Colton could not fully read. Grief, yes, but also something fiercer. Recognition. The recognition of a woman seeing proof that the man she loved had been exactly who she always believed he was. She did not step onto the bridge. Not yet. She stood at the edge and placed one hand on the stone railing, and she closed her eyes, and she breathed. Ghost sat beside her and did not move. That evening, after the others had gone, Colton sat on the bridge floor, cleaning rust from a section of the iron railing. Ghost lay nearby, his chin resting on his paws, watching the river with half-closed eyes. The rain had finally stopped, and the sky had opened into a violet dusk, streaked with gold. Then Ghost's head came up. Not the slow lift of curiosity. The sharp, instant alertness that meant something had changed in the environment. His ears rotated. His body went rigid. He was staring at the tree line beyond the bridge. A moment later, Colton heard it too. A branch snapping, then another, then footsteps, deliberate, unhurried. The footsteps of someone who wanted to be noticed. A man emerged from the trail. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet or a little more, lean in the way of someone who maintained himself through discipline rather than labor. His hair was dark threaded with gray at the temples, cut with the precision of regular city barber visits. His face was clean-shaven, composed, and his pale gray eyes carried the calm confidence of a man who had spent decades negotiating with people who believed they had leverage. He wore a charcoal outdoor jacket made from expensive technical fabric, dark trousers, and hiking boots that looked new enough to have never encountered real mud. "You must be Colton Mercer," the man said. His smile was polite and professional, the kind people used when they were about to ask for something they already believed belonged to them. Ghost stood up. He did not growl. He did not bark. He simply stood beside Colton and stared at the stranger with an unblinking focus that communicated more than any sound could. "Garrett Voss," the man said, extending a hand. "Development consultant." Colton looked at the hand, then he shook it briefly. The grip was firm and practiced. Voss glanced at Ghost. Impressive animal. Ghost did not acknowledge the compliment. "I understand you've been exploring an old property on the North Ridge," Voss said casually. "Maybe?" Voss smiled again. "That bridge is located on land my company is currently in the process of acquiring. We're planning a sustainable eco-resort in the valley. Cabins, guided trails, a small lodge. The kind of development that brings jobs to towns like Alder Ridge." Linnea, who had been organizing documents inside the stone house, stepped outside, her arms folded across her chest. "That land is under federal environmental review," she said flatly. "Temporary review," Voss replied. His smile never wavered. "What do you want?" Colton asked. Voss clasped his hands behind his back. "The old bridge complicates things. If it's classified as a protected heritage site, the entire project becomes difficult. Those documents you discovered were never officially submitted to any authority, which leaves us in a delicate position." He turned to Colton. "If the materials were to simply remain unfiled, no one would be harmed. The valley could move forward into a prosperous future, and you would be compensated generously for your cooperation." The bridge went quiet. Even the river seemed to lower its voice. "You're asking me to bury the truth," Colton said. "I'm asking you to consider the bigger picture. The bigger picture is that a man disappeared trying to stop exactly what your company wants to do." Voss's expression hardened slightly, just enough to reveal the steel beneath the polish. "That was 40 years ago, and the same people are still trying to profit from it." Linnea stepped forward. "I ran the corporate records. Your company Voss is a direct descendant of Ridgeline Timber. Different name, same ownership chain, same land, same plan." For the first time, something shifted in Voss's composure. A flicker. Brief. Controlled. But real. "Ancient history," he said. "Not to Margaret Harlan," Colton replied. Voss straightened his jacket. "Well," he said calmly, "I suppose we'll see how this plays out." He turned toward the trail. Before leaving, he paused and looked back. His eyes moved from Colton to Ghost, then to the bridge. "It would be unfortunate," he said, "if things became unpleasant for people in this town who have already suffered enough." Then he walked into the forest and disappeared. Ghost watched until the man was gone. Then he turned to Colton and pressed his nose into Colton's palm. One nudge. Firm. Clear. "I am here, and that man is trouble." 3 days later, Colton learned that Voss had been visiting families in Alder Ridge. Not threatening, not demanding. Offering. Jobs. Investment. The same promises Ridgeline Timber had made 45 years ago, wrapped in new language and cleaner clothes. And he was using Thomas Harlan's history to do it, reminding people that Thomas was the one who had brought the first company in, suggesting that Voss's project would finally fix what Thomas had broken, turning Thomas's guilt into a selling point. The town was listening. Colton could feel it in the way people at the diner avoided his eyes, in the way the gas station attendant made change without speaking, in the careful distance that Alder Ridge maintained from the stranger who had come to dig up a past they had spent half a century burying, It was Bert who told him directly. "People are scared," Bert said, hammering a new post into the bridge railing with more force than necessary. "Voss is offering money. You're offering a dead man's journal. In a town, this poor money wins." Colton said nothing. He was on his knees cleaning moss from the bridge stones, and his left knee had been screaming at him for the past hour. Ghost lay nearby, his chin on his paws, watching a hawk circle over the valley. Then Ghost's head lifted, not toward the sky, toward Colton. The dog rose and walked over. He stood close enough that his shoulder touched Colton's arm, then lowered his head onto Colton's thigh. Not because Colton had called him, because Ghost had sensed the shift, the tightening in Colton's shoulders, the way his hands had gone still against the stone, the invisible weight that was settling over him like the sky before a storm. Bert watched this. He put the hammer down. "That dog knows something I don't," he said quietly. "He knows everything you don't," Colton replied, but his voice was thin. That night, Ghost woke Colton at 2 a.m, not with a bark, with pressure. The dog had climbed onto the bed and was lying across Colton's chest, 70 pounds of warm weight and steady breathing pinning him to the present. Colton's hands were shaking. His shirt was soaked with sweat. The cabin smelled like pine and wood smoke, but in his mind it smelled like dust and diesel and the copper tang of blood and sand. Marcus, the flashback had come without warning. It always did. One moment Colton was asleep. The next he was back in the compound, the walls shaking, the radio screaming static. And Marcus was calling his name from somewhere he could not reach. Marcus's voice cutting through smoke and noise and the terrible high-pitched whine that meant the blast wave was still traveling. "Colton! Colton, I'm hit! I'm right here! Colton!" And then nothing. Just the dust settling, and the silence that came after the silence, that came after the sound, and the knowledge, cold and permanent, and carved into every cell of his body, that he had not been fast enough. Ghost pressed harder. His heartbeat thumped against Colton's ribs, slow, steady, present. Colton's hands found the dog's fur. He gripped it, held on, followed the rhythm. One breath, another. The cabin came back. The smell of pine, the creak of the wood stove, the weight of Ghost on his chest, real and warm and alive. "I'm here," Colton whispered. "I'm here." Ghost licked his jaw once, then rested his head on Colton's shoulder and breathed. They lay like that until dawn. Colton did not sleep again, but he was present. And present, he had learned, was sometimes the most a man could ask for. The crisis at the bridge came on a cold Tuesday morning when the sky was the color of steel and the wind carried the first real bite of approaching winter. Ghost cut his front left paw on a rusted nail embedded in a rotting plank near the bridge entrance. The nail had been hidden beneath moss, invisible, until the dog's weight drove it through the soft pad of his foot. Ghost yelped once, a sound so rare and sharp that Colton's entire body went electric with fear. Blood, not much. A thin red line on gray stone. But enough. Colton dropped everything. He scooped Ghost into his arms, all 70 pounds of him, and carried the dog down the trail at a pace that made his ruined knee howl with every step. Ghost did not struggle. He pressed against Colton's chest and watched his face with those calm, knowing eyes, as though the dog understood that his own injury mattered less than what the injury was doing to the man carrying him. Bert called after him. Colton did not hear. The veterinarian in Alder Ridge was a woman named Dr. Whelan, who operated out of a converted garage behind her house. She cleaned the wound, applied antiseptic, and wrapped the paw in white gauze, while Colton stood beside the table with his hands clenched so tight his knuckles had gone white. "He'll be fine," Dr. Whelan said. "It's a surface puncture. Clean cut. No tendon damage. He'll limp for a few days, but he'll heal." Colton exhaled. The breath came out ragged, broken, as though he had been holding it since the moment he saw the blood on the stone. Dr. Whelan studied him for a long moment. She had the quiet perception of someone who spent her days reading animals and had learned that the skill transferred to their owners. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Colton nodded. "What are you really trying to fix, the dog's paw or something else?" Colton did not answer. He gathered Ghost carefully from the table, and the dog pressed his bandaged paw against Colton's chest like a child offering a scraped knee for a kiss, and Colton carried him out into the cold gray afternoon. On the drive back, thunder rumbled over the mountains. Distant. A low vibration more felt than heard. Colton's hands tightened on the wheel. Ghost, sitting in the passenger seat with his bandaged paw resting on the console, turned his head toward Colton. The thunder came again, closer, and the world folded. One moment Colton was on a Montana highway. The next he was in a compound in a country that smelled like dust and burning plastic and the sharp animal scent of fear. The steering wheel became a wall. The truck cabin became a room with no windows. And Marcus was there calling his name, always calling his name. And Colton could not move, could not breathe, could not reach him. The truck drifted toward the shoulder. Gravel rattled beneath the tires. Ghost moved. The dog leaned across the console and pressed his full weight against Colton's right arm. Not a nudge, a commitment. 70 pounds of warmth and solidity anchoring Colton to the seat, to the truck, to the road beneath the wheels. Ghost placed his head on Colton's thigh and breathed, slow, deliberate. The same rhythm he used at 3 a.m. when the nightmares came. "Breathe with me. I am here. Breathe with me." Colton's foot found the brake. The truck slowed, stopped. He sat on the shoulder of the highway with rain beginning to dot the windshield and his hands shaking on the wheel and 70 pounds of dog anchoring him to the seat. "I'm here," Colton said. His voice was barely a sound. "I'm here." Ghost breathed. Colton followed. 30 seconds, a minute. The compound faded. Marcus's voice faded. The smell of dust and diesel faded, and Montana came back. Pine trees, rain, the highway, the weight of a dog who had never once failed to bring him home. Colton rested his forehead against the steering wheel. "I couldn't save him," he whispered. "I was 10 feet away, and I couldn't save him." Ghost shifted his weight until his side rested flush against Colton's leg. His bandaged paw settled gently on Colton's knee, a small hurt offering comfort to a larger one. They sat on that highway shoulder for 20 minutes before Colton put the truck in gear and drove home. Garrett Voss came to Margaret's house on a Thursday afternoon. Colton learned about it from Wyatt. The boy appeared at the bridge 2 hours later, out of breath. His face flushed and his eyes wide, with something that looked less like fear and more like the desperate confusion of a child who does not understand why the world keeps threatening the people he loves. "A man came to Grandma's house," Wyatt said. "He wore fancy clothes and he smiled too much. He told Grandma she should sell the house. He said nice things, but his eyes were mean. Grandma told him to leave, and he said she would lose the house anyway." The boy's voice trembled on the last word. Not from cold. From the particular helplessness of being 9 years old and watching someone threaten the only person who has never abandoned you. He put papers on the table, Wyatt continued. Grandma didn't touch them. She just looked at them like they were poison. Then he said something about how Thomas would have wanted the town to move forward. And Grandma's hands started shaking. She told him to get out of her house. She said it quiet. Real quiet. That's when I knew she was the most angry. Ghost went to Wyatt immediately. The dog sat beside the boy and pressed against his leg, and Wyatt's hand found the fur behind Ghost's ear and held on the way a drowning person holds a rope. Colton knelt down so he was level with the boy's eyes. His knee protested. He ignored it. Wyatt, look at me. The boy looked. Nobody is going to take your grandma's house. Do you hear me? Wyatt's eyes searched his face, looking for the lie, looking for the gap between the promise and the truth. The way children learn to look after enough adults have let them down. You promise, Wyatt whispered. Colton hesitated. The words stuck in his throat like a stone. He had made promises before. To Marcus. To himself. Promises that shattered against reality and left wreckage that could not be cleaned up. Ghost nudged his hand. One push. Gentle. Firm. I promise, Colton said. Bert, who had been sanding a railing post nearby and pretending not to listen, set down his tools. He walked over to Wyatt and crouched beside Ghost. His big, weathered hands rested on his knees. Hey, kid, Bert said. You see this dog? Wyatt nodded. This dog once served in the military. He saved people's lives. And right now, his job is keeping an eye on you and your grandma. So whenever you feel scared, you just look at him. If he's not scared, you don't need to be either. Wyatt looked at Ghost. Ghost looked back with calm, steady eyes. He's not scared, Wyatt said. No, sir, Bert said. He is not. That night, the nightmares were the worst they had been in months. Marcus did not just call his name. Marcus asked, why? Why didn't you come? Why didn't you move? Why am I here and you are there and the distance between us is only 10 feet, but it might as well be forever? Colton woke, gasping. Ghost was already on the bed, already draped across his chest, already breathing. I promised to protect Marcus, Colton said into the darkness. His voice was raw, stripped, the voice of a man speaking to the only being in the world who would hear him without judgment. I failed, and now I promised a 9-year-old boy that I would protect his grandmother. And every time I look at Wyatt, I see Marcus. I see the person I am going to fail. Ghost rested his head on Colton's chest. His breathing did not change. Steady, patient. The breathing of a creature who did not know how to give up on someone. The darkest moment did not come from Garrett Voss. It did not come from the town or the deadline or the damaged bridge. It came from inside Colton Mercer, from the place where Marcus Dunn still lived and still called his name and still waited for help that was never coming. Colton sat in his cabin on a cold evening 16 days before the Heritage deadline. Ghost lay by the wood stove. The documents from the bridge were spread across the table, organized and cataloged, ready to be filed. The work was almost done. Linnea had the legal case nearly complete. Bert had the bridge railing repaired enough for an inspection team to walk safely. Everything was in place. And Colton could not breathe, because finishing meant caring, and caring meant the possibility of loss. And loss was the only thing Colton Mercer was truly an expert in. He picked up his phone and called Silas Drummond. The old man answered on the third ring. His voice was rough with sleep. I need to stop, Colton said. I need to walk away from this. I keep telling myself I'm doing this for Thomas, for Margaret, for the bridge. But the truth is, I'm terrified. Every person I've tried to protect, I've lost. And if I finish this, and it falls apart, if Voss wins, and Margaret loses her home, and that bridge comes down, it will be because I wasn't enough. Again, Silas was quiet for a long time. The silence stretched through the phone line like a bridge of its own, connecting two men across miles of dark forest and decades of separate grief. Then Silas spoke. His voice was low and steady and carried the weight of a man who had buried a son and lived with the silence of cowardice for 45 years. "You think walking away protects you," Silas said. "But it doesn't. Walking away is not rest. Walking away is exile. I know because I have lived in that exile since the day I turned my back on Margaret Harlan. 45 years of walking past her in the grocery store. 45 years of silence that I called safety but was really just a slower way of dying." Colton closed his eyes. "I lost my boy," Silas said. "You know that. 9 years old. The river took him. And after that, I decided the safest thing was to never stand up for anyone again. Because standing up meant caring, and caring meant losing, and I had already lost everything I could stand to lose." His voice cracked. "Just once. Just enough. But here's what I learned too late, Colton. Quitting is not rest. Quitting is exile. And I will not let the river take one more person while I sit in my chair and say nothing." Colton sat in the silence that followed. Ghost had lifted his head from the floor and was watching him with unblinking eyes that held no judgment and no retreat. "I'm scared," Colton said. "Good," Silas replied. "Scared means you care. And caring is the only thing that has ever been worth a damn in this world." Colton hung up the phone. He sat for a long time. Then he stood. He walked to the closet. He pulled out his duffel bag and began packing. Clothes, knife, flashlight. The essentials of a man who had practiced leaving. Ghost watched from the floor. His ears tracked every movement. His body remained still, but his eyes carried a question that Colton refused to meet. Colton zipped the bag, slung it over his shoulder, walked to the door, and stopped, because Ghost was already there. The dog had moved without sound. He stood in front of the door the way he had once stood in front of compound entrances in countries where the wrong step meant the last step. Shoulders square, ears forward. Eyes locked on Colton with an intensity that was not anger and not fear. It was certainty. The absolute, unwavering certainty of a creature who knew exactly what he was doing and why. "Move," Colton said. Ghost did not move. Colton stepped to the left. Ghost shifted with him. Colton stepped to the right. Ghost blocked. "Move, Ghost." The dog stared at him. His tail did not wag. His ears did not flatten. He simply stood filling the doorway with 70 pounds of loyalty that refused to negotiate. Colton felt something break inside his chest. Not the sharp break of violence or the sudden break of shock. The slow, grinding break of a wall that had been holding back everything for 18 months, finally giving way. He dropped the duffel bag. He dropped to his knees. His hands found Ghost's fur. His forehead pressed against the dog's shoulder. His breath came in ragged pieces that were not quite sobs and not quite silence, but something in between that had no name, because the English language does not have a word for the sound a man makes when he finally stops running from the thing he cannot outrun. "I'm tired," Colton whispered. "I'm so tired." Ghost leaned into him. The dog's weight pressed against Colton's chest, warm and solid and alive. Ghost licked his hand. Once. Twice. Then rested his chin on Colton's shoulder and breathed. Slow, steady. I am here. I am not leaving. Breathe with me, Colton breathed. The cabin was quiet. The fire crackled. Outside, the forest held its darkness close, and somewhere 2 miles away, a single light still glowed on Margaret Harlan's porch. The way it had glowed every night for 45 years, steady and patient, and refusing to go out. Colton did not pick up the bag. He stayed. Morning came gray and cold and smelling of pine. Colton sent 2 words to Linnea by text message. Keep going. Then he drove to the bridge. The work continued. But something had changed. Colton moved differently now. Not faster, not louder, but with a steadiness that had not been there before, as though the man who had tried to walk out the door the night before had left something behind when he dropped that bag. Something heavy. Something he had been carrying for 18 months without knowing how to set it down. Bert noticed. He said nothing, but he nailed a new sign to the bridge post that morning. Under new management, the dog won. Ghost sat beneath the sign with the quiet dignity of someone who had always known. Linnea arrived at noon with updated paperwork and the news that the federal office had acknowledged receipt of their heritage application. The clock was still ticking. 12 days remained, but the gears were turning. And then in the late afternoon, Margaret came to the bridge. Not at the edge the way she had before, not watching from a distance. This time, Margaret Harlan walked onto the stone bridge for the first time in 45 years. She moved slowly. Wyatt held her left hand. Ghost walked on her right side, matching her pace, his shoulder against her hip. Each step was deliberate. Each step cost her something. Colton could see it in the way her jaw tightened, in the way her free hand trembled, in the way her eyes moved across the ancient stone as though she were reading a letter written in a language only she could understand. Bert stopped hammering. Linnea looked up from her paperwork. Silas rose from his stone seat. The whole bridge went quiet. Even the river seemed to lower its voice as Margaret Harlan walked across the stones her husband had guarded with his life. She reached the center of the bridge. She stopped. She placed her palm flat against the stone railing. The same railing Thomas had repaired with his own hands. The same stone he had touched thousands of times in the years before the company came, and the town turned, and the world decided he was the villain. Margaret closed her eyes. He would love this, she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the silence of that moment, with the river below and the mountains around, and 5 people holding their breath on a bridge that should not have survived, but did, every syllable reached every ear. He would love that someone finally came. Then Margaret Harlan did something she had not done in 45 years. She sat down on the bridge. She folded her hands in her lap. And she stayed, not for a moment, not for a visit. She stayed the way a person stays when they have finally returned to the place they were always meant to be. She stayed the way a woman stays when she has spent 45 years standing at the edge of everything and has finally found the strength to sit down in the middle of it. Ghost lay down beside her. His chin rested on his paws. His eyes watched the river. His bandaged paw rested gently against Margaret's knee, and she placed her hand over it, and the two of them sat together in the fading light like old friends who had known each other in another life. Colton turned away so that no one would see his face, because the sight of a 74-year-old woman sitting on a bridge her dead husband had protected with a dog who had chosen her grief as his own was the kind of thing that broke a man open in ways he could not put back together. And Colton Mercer was not ready to be broken open in front of people, but he was beginning to understand that maybe being broken open was the point. Back in the stone house, while the others rested, Colton returned to the fireplace wall. Ghost had been drawn to it since their first visit, sniffing at one particular stone, scratching at it, returning to it again and again, with the quiet insistence of a dog who knew something the humans had missed. Colton pried the stone loose. Behind it, hidden within the thick wall, was a narrow cavity. And inside that cavity lay three things. The first was a single page of paper, Thomas Harlan's final journal entry. One sentence. If someone ever reads this, please make sure the bridge remains standing. The second was a gold wedding ring, worn smooth by years of use. Thomas had removed it and hidden it here with his evidence because he knew that if something happened to him, they would take his belongings, but they would never find the truth. The third was a rolled tube of paper. Colton unrolled it carefully. It was a blueprint, hand-drawn with the precision of a trained engineer. Not a blueprint of destruction, a blueprint of salvation. Thomas Harlan had designed a plan to reinforce the natural rock dam upstream. Using the same engineering skills he had once lent to the company, he had created a detailed technical plan to strengthen the very structure they wanted to destroy. The blueprint had notes in the margins, names, the names of every family downstream whose land would have been flooded if the dam was broken. Thomas had listed them all, every single one, including the families who had turned their backs on him, including the people who called him a coward and a saboteur and worse. He had tried to save them all, even the ones who hated him. Colton held the ring in one hand and the blueprint in the other, and he understood finally what kind of man Thomas Harlan had been. Not a saint, not a hero from the beginning. A man who made a mistake recognized it and spent the rest of his life trying to fix it, even when no one believed he was trying. Even when the people he was trying to save were the ones holding the stones. Ghost sat beside Colton in the dim light of the stone house and rested his head on Colton's knee. "I know," Colton said softly. "I know." He looked toward the bridge where Margaret still sat in the fading light, her hand on the stone railing, her grandson beside her, the river flowing beneath them with the patience of something that had always known the truth would surface eventually. Colton placed the ring carefully in his jacket pocket. He rolled the blueprint and secured it with the other documents. And he understood that what he held was not just evidence for a heritage application. It was the last chapter of a love story that had been waiting 45 years to be finished. Ghost sat beside him in the gathering dark, his flank warm against Colton's leg, his eyes reflecting the last light that came through the narrow windows. Outside, the sound of the river beneath the bridge was steady and deep, the sound of something that had been carrying secrets for decades and was finally ready to let them go. Colton thought about Margaret sitting on the bridge that afternoon, about Wyatt's hand on Ghost's fur, about Silas's confession in the general store, about Bert's signs and Linnea's paperwork and the strange fragile community that had formed around a bridge that most of the town still wanted to forget. He thought about Marcus. For the first time in 18 months, the thought did not arrive with the sound of an explosion. It arrived with the memory of Marcus laughing. Marcus throwing a tennis ball for a dog on a base in a country 10,000 miles from here. Marcus saying in that easy drawl of his, "You think too much, Mercer. Just do the next right thing." The next right thing. Colton looked at the ring in his palm, at the blueprint on the table, At Ghost, who watched him with the patience of a creature who had never once doubted that his person would eventually find his way. "Okay," Colton whispered. "Okay." And somewhere in the space between the stone walls and the setting sun, Ghost lifted his nose and sniffed the air inside the fireplace cavity one more time, then turned to look at Colton with an expression that said clearly and without ambiguity, "There is more. There is always more." But that would have to wait for morning. Colton brought the envelope to Margaret on a Sunday morning. The air was sharp with the first real cold of the season. Frost had painted the grass white along the gravel road, and the mountains behind Alder Ridge wore a thin line of fresh snow near their peaks, like a promise of what was coming. Ghost walked beside Colton up the porch steps, his bandaged paw nearly healed now his stride, almost even again. The dog had recovered the way dogs do, without complaint, without performance, simply allowing the body to do what the body knows how to do when given time and stillness. Margaret was sitting on the porch in a wooden chair with a wool blanket across her lap. Wyatt was inside. Colton could hear the boy talking to himself the way children do when they are building something imaginary, narrating a world that makes more sense than the real one. Margaret looked up when Colton approached. Her dark eyes moved to the envelope in his hand, and something in her face changed. Not surprise, recognition. As though she had been waiting for this moment, the way she had waited for everything else in her life. Patiently, without certainty, but without surrender. Colton sat in the chair beside her. Ghost lay between them, his chin on Margaret's foot, his body warm against the cold boards. "I found this in the wall of the stone house," Colton said. "Hidden behind a stone in the fireplace. Thomas left it there with his evidence." He held out the envelope. The paper was soft and yellowed. 2 words on the front in Thomas Harlan's handwriting. "For Margaret." Margaret took the envelope with both hands, her fingers always trembling now, steadied as they touched the paper. She opened it carefully, not tearing, unfolding. The letter inside was 1 page, handwritten. The ink had faded to brown, but the words were clear. Margaret read in silence. Colton did not watch her face. He watched the mountains instead, giving her the privacy that a letter this old and this heavy deserved. When she finished, Margaret folded the letter against her chest the way she had folded the journal the first time. But this time, she spoke. "He says he is sorry," she said. Her voice was steady in that particular way that voices become steady when a person has decided that this truth is going to be spoken no matter what it costs. "He says he knows the town blames him, and he knows I have carried that blame alone. He says he tried to send word to the government, but he does not know if the letters arrived. He says the evidence is in the bridge and in the walls, and he hopes someone finds it someday." She paused. Her eyes closed. When she opened them again, they were bright with tears that she did not try to stop. "And he says the light. He says he can see the porch light from the ridge above the bridge. Every night. He says he watches it, and it is how he knows I still believe in him. He says that light is the only thing that has kept him from losing his mind." Margaret's voice broke on the last word. Not shattered, cracked. The way old wood cracks under weight it has carried too long. The sound of something that has held and held and held and has finally been given permission to let go. Ghost settled closer, his shoulder resting against Margaret's calf. His warm body steadied her the way it steadied Colton during the worst nights. The dog did not look up. He simply stayed the way he always stayed because that was the one thing Ghost knew how to do better than any creature Colton had ever known. Colton reached into his jacket pocket and brought out the ring. It sat in his palm, small and gold, and worn smooth by years of a man's hand. The metal caught the weak morning sun and held it. He hid this with the evidence, Colton said. I think he knew that if something happened to him, they would take his belongings, but they would never look inside the walls. He wanted the ring to stay with the truth, so that someday both could come home together. Margaret looked at the ring. Her hand rose slowly. She took it from Colton's palm and held it between her thumb and finger, turning it in the light, reading the inscription inside that only she could see. Then Margaret Harlan slid the ring onto her left hand beside the wedding band she had never removed. She did not speak. She did not need to. The gesture said everything that 45 years of silence had been waiting to say. I waited. You came home. Not in the way I hoped, but you came home. Ghost lifted his head and rested it on Margaret's knee. Wyatt appeared in the doorway, drawn by the silence that was louder than any sound he had heard that morning. He saw his grandmother's face. He saw the ring. He crossed the porch and put his arms around her neck, and Margaret held her grandson with one hand and held her husband's letter with the other, and the porch light burned above them in the morning sun, the way it had burned every night for 45 years. Colton stood and walked to the edge of the porch. He gripped the railing and looked out at the mountains and breathed. Because if he stayed in that chair one more second, he was going to fall apart in front of a woman and a boy who needed him to be solid. Ghost came to him, pressed against his leg. One nudge. I know the nudge said, I know. Linnea Frost had spent 9 days building a legal case with the precision and stubbornness of a woman who understood that bureaucracy could be defeated, but only with its own weapons. She had filed the heritage application. She had documented every page of Thomas Harlan's evidence. She had photographed the bridge, the stone house, the hidden chamber, and the cavity in the fireplace wall. But the application alone was not enough. The Federal Review Board required a physical inspection of the site before granting protection status. An assessment team needed to walk the bridge, examine the structure, and determine whether it met the criteria for historical and environmental preservation. The inspection was scheduled for Wednesday, 5 days before the review period expired and the land became available for private sale. Colton stood on the bridge Monday morning and looked at the damage. The collapsed section near the eastern railing, the rotted planks at the entrance, the mortar crumbling between stones on the north wall of the house. It was not a ruin, but it was not safe enough for a government team to walk across and sign off on. We need 5 days of work, Bert said, standing beside him with his hands on his hips. And about 3 more people. We have 2 days, Colton replied. Bert looked at Ghost, who sat between them surveying the bridge with what appeared to be professional concern. What does the foreman think? Bert asked. Ghost sneezed. That's about right, Bert said. They worked. Colton and Bert and Linnea and Silas, who moved slowly, but whose hands still knew how to hold a tool. Margaret came each afternoon with food. Sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, thermoses of coffee, oatmeal cookies that Wyatt helped bake and that Ghost received a share of when Margaret pretended not to notice. The town had not joined them, but Colton had stopped expecting the town to join them. He had learned something in those weeks at the bridge that he had never learned in the military. You cannot force people to see what they are not ready to see. You can only do the work and hope that the work itself becomes the argument. Linnea had another plan. She had arranged for the evidence display at the bridge site to coincide with the inspection. Not a presentation, not a speech. Simply the documents laid out on tables inside the stone house, organized chronologically telling Thomas Harlan's story in his own handwriting. The journal. The survey maps he drew for the company. The same maps with his corrections written over them in angry ink. The letters he tried to send. The blueprint for reinforcing the dam. And in the margins of that blueprint, written in Thomas Harlan's precise hand, the names of every family whose land would have been flooded if the dam had been destroyed. Every family in Alder Ridge, including the ones who had blamed him, including the ones who had turned Margaret into a ghost in her own town. Thomas Harlan had listed them all. He had tried to save every single one of them, even the ones who called him a coward. Let them see it for themselves, Linnea said. Don't explain it. Don't argue. Just let the evidence speak. Colton nodded. He understood. Truth did not need a lawyer. Truth needed a witness. The inspection team arrived on Wednesday morning, 2 officials with clipboards and measuring equipment. They walked every section of the bridge, examined the foundation, the arch, the railing, the house. They photographed, measured, conferred. At the end of the afternoon, the lead inspector delivered his verdict. The bridge structure is sound, the inspector said. The arch is remarkably well preserved. The house needs work, but the foundation is solid. Colton felt something loosen in his chest. However, the inspector continued, the railing section on the eastern approach does not meet safety standards. 3 posts are compromised. Until those are replaced or reinforced, we cannot certify the site as accessible. The loosening stopped. How long do we have? Linnea asked. The review period expires Monday. If the site is not certified by then, the application defaults to incomplete and the land enters the private sale process. 5 days, 3 compromised posts, and a town that still would not look Colton in the eye. Linnea drove back to Alder Ridge to file a progress update. Bert began assessing the damaged posts. Silas sat on his stone and stared at the river. Margaret stood at the center of the bridge with her hand on the railing as though she could hold the entire structure together by touch alone. Colton walked to the edge of the bridge and looked down at the water. Ghost followed and sat beside him. We're going to lose, Colton said quietly. Ghost bumped his hand with his nose. Not comfort. Disagreement. They worked through the night. Colton and Bert by lantern light, removing the damaged posts and fitting new ones. Colton's knee screamed with every squat, every lift. He ignored it the way he had ignored it for years. Ghost lay nearby, his amber eyes catching the lantern light like small fires in the darkness. Occasionally, he would rise, walk the length of the bridge, check the tree line, and return. The eternal patrol. At 3 a.m, headlights appeared on the trail. Colton straightened. Bert set down his hammer. Ghost stood ears forward, body alert. A pickup truck parked at the edge of the clearing. Then another. Then a third. Doors opened. Figures emerged in the cold, dark breath visible in the lantern light. Colton recognized none of them at first. Then Silas appeared from the darkness, walking slowly beside a man Colton had never seen before. "This is Warren Polk," Silas said. His voice was rough with cold and something else, emotion held in check. He was at the evidence display today. He has something to say. Warren Polk was in his mid-60s, broad and weathered, with a face that looked like it had been angry for a very long time, and was now trying to remember how to be something else. He stood at the edge of the bridge and looked at it the way a man looks at a mirror when he does not like what he sees. "I was at the display," Polk said. His voice was low, reluctant, each word pulled from somewhere deep. "I saw the blueprint, the one Thomas drew, the one that shows how to save the dam." He stopped, swallowed. "My family's name is on that blueprint." Thomas listed every family that would lose their land if the dam broke, and my family is on that list. He was trying to save us. Polk's jaw tightened. He was trying to save us, and I spent 45 years telling anyone who would listen that he was a coward and a traitor. The bridge was silent except for the river and the wind. Polk turned to look at the stone house, then at the bridge, then at Colton. "I brought my sons," he said. "We know how to work. Tell us what needs doing." Behind him, 2 younger men stood by the truck's tool belts already strapped on. One of them raised a hand in a small, uncertain wave. Colton looked at Silas. The old man's eyes were bright in the lantern light. Bright with something that looked like the first breath a man takes after being underwater for 45 years. "Eastern railing," Colton said. 3 posts. Polk nodded. "We'll get it done." They worked until dawn. Polk and his sons, Bert, Colton, even Silas, who could not swing a hammer but who held the lantern steady and handed nails to anyone who needed them. Ghost moved among them, all checking on each person, in turn pressing his nose against a hand here, leaning against a leg there. The eternal circuit of a dog who understood that his job was not to build the bridge. His job was to hold the people building it together. By sunrise, the railing was finished. Colton stood at the center of the bridge and looked at the new posts pale against the ancient stone, and felt something he had not felt in 18 months. Not joy, exactly. Not relief. Something quieter and more durable. The feeling a man gets when he realizes that the thing he was afraid to start has been finished, and the world did not collapse. And the people around him are still standing. Morning light poured across the valley and turned the river into a ribbon of gold. The inspection team returned on Thursday. They walked the bridge again, measured the new posts, tested every joint. The lead inspector stood in the center of the bridge, writing on his clipboard. Ghost sat beside Colton, perfectly still. The inspector looked up. "Site certified," he said. Bert let out a yell that echoed off the mountains. Linnea closed her eyes and nodded once slowly, the way she did when something she had fought for had finally come through. Silas lowered himself onto his stone and stared at the river. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps a name. Margaret stood at the center of the bridge with her hand on the new railing, the ring on her finger catching the morning light. She did not cry. She did not cheer. She simply stood, and her face held the expression of a woman who had lived long enough to see justice arrive not with trumpets and fanfare, but with a man in a khaki jacket and a clipboard. Ghost lifted his head. His ears stood straight. His amber eyes caught the light and held it, and his tail moved once a single slow sweep across the ancient stone. The federal board acted faster than anyone expected. Linnea's documentation was thorough, her legal arguments precise, and the corporate connection between Garrett Voss's company and Ridgeline Timber was undeniable. Within 2 weeks, the stone bridge and the surrounding valley were designated a protected historical and environmental preservation site. Voss's development project was terminated permanently. Thomas Harlan's evidence was entered into the official record. His blueprint for reinforcing the dam was cited as a significant historical engineering document, and his name, which had been spoken as a curse in Alder Ridge for 45 years, began to be spoken differently. Not as a hero yet. That would take more time. But as a man. A real man who had made a mistake and spent his life trying to correct it, even when no one believed he was trying. Even the ones who had held the stones the longest began slowly to set them down. The gathering at the bridge happened on a Saturday in late October. Not a ceremony, not a festival. Just people coming to a place that mattered the way people do when they want to be part of something they cannot fully explain. Margaret was there first. She arrived with Wyatt at dawn before anyone else and sat in her spot at the center of the bridge with a thermos of coffee and Thomas's letter in her pocket. Ghost lay beside her, his chin on his paws. The river below moved with the deep, steady rhythm of something that had been waiting a very long time to celebrate. People came in ones and twos. Bert arrived with a truck full of folding chairs and another sign. This one read, "This bridge protected by Thomas Harlan, completed by Alder Ridge." He nailed it to the post at the entrance and stood back and admired it with the satisfaction of a man who had finally found the right words. Linnea came with a box of documents for anyone who wanted to read them. She set up a table inside the stone house and let the pages speak for themselves. Silas arrived slowly leaning on a walking stick he had not used the week before. He sat in his spot near the edge of the bridge and watched people file past. When Warren Polk arrived and paused near the old man, the two of them looked at each other for a long moment. Polk extended his hand. Silas took it. They did not speak. Some debts are too large for words. They can only be acknowledged with a grip and a nod, and the silent understanding that forgiveness is not a single act, but a practice that must be repeated every day. More people came. Families Colton had never met. Faces that had watched him from behind diner windows and gas station counters. People who had avoided Margaret's eyes for decades now stood on the bridge beside her and did not look away. One woman, older with silver hair and a face that had been hardened by years of mountain weather, approached Margaret's chair. She stood there for a moment, her mouth working, searching for words that had been locked away for 45 years. "I moved pews," the woman finally said. "At church. I moved away from you. I let you sit alone. I knew it was wrong, and I did it anyway, because everyone else did, and I was too afraid to be the one who stayed." Margaret looked up at her. The woman's eyes were red. Her hands were clenched at her sides. "I know," Margaret said softly. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I sat 3 rows away for 40 years and told myself it wasn't cruelty because I never said a word against you. But silence is its own kind of cruelty, isn't it?" It was not a question. It was a confession. The kind that takes 40 years to build the courage for and 30 seconds to speak and changes the shape of everything that comes after. Margaret reached out and took the woman's hand, held it, not tightly, gently, the way you hold something fragile that has been broken and is being offered back. "I know that too," Margaret said. The woman sat down beside Margaret. She did not let go of her hand, and they sat together on the bridge, 2 old women who had once shared the same church and the same town, and the same Sunday mornings, separated for 45 years by a silence that had finally been given a voice. Others followed, one by one. Not in a rush of guilt or performance. Some brought words. Some brought only their presence, standing on the bridge, as a way of saying what they could not yet speak. Some brought food, which is the oldest language of reconciliation in small towns. And one man, old and stooped, brought a framed photograph of Thomas Harlan standing beside the bridge, which he had kept in his attic for decades because he could not bring himself to throw it away and could not bring himself to display it. He gave it to Margaret without a word. Ghost moved through the gathering like a thread stitching separate pieces into something whole. A nudge here, a lean there, a moment of sitting beside someone who was standing alone, as though the dog understood that healing was not a single event, but a series of small connections. In the afternoon, someone brought sparklers for the children. Small ones, the kind that hissed and popped and threw tiny showers of white light into the cold autumn air. Wyatt held one in each hand and waved them in circles, laughing the sound bright and clean in the mountain air. Then a car backfired on the road below the ridge. The sound was sharp and sudden, a crack that split the air like a shot. Wyatt flinched. His sparklers dropped. His body went rigid, and his face drained of color, and his hands came up to cover his ears in the instinctive protective gesture of a child who had heard too many slammed doors and shouted words in a house where love had turned to war. Colton was beside him in 3 seconds. Ghost was there in 2. The dog reached Wyatt first. He pressed his body against the boy's legs and rested his head against Wyatt's stomach, warm and solid and utterly calm. His dark, gentle eyes looked up at the boy's face with an expression that said, without words, without sound, without anything except presence, I am here. You are safe. Nothing is going to hurt you while I am here. Colton knelt beside them. His knee hit the cold stone, and the pain flared, and he did not care. Hey, Colton said. His voice was low and steady, the same voice he used with Ghost during the worst nights. Wyatt, look at me. The boy's eyes found his, wide, wet, searching. You see Ghost, Colton said. Wyatt nodded. He's my best friend. He has kept me safe through things I cannot even tell you about. And right now, his only job is keeping you safe. So here is what we are going to do. We are going to breathe with him. Watch his chest. See how it moves in and out. Slow. Just follow him. Wyatt looked down at Ghost. The dog's chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm. The boy's small hands found Ghost's fur. His fingers curled into the warmth, in Colton said. And out, Wyatt breathed. Once, twice, 3 times. The color came back to his face. His shoulders dropped. His hands loosened. He wants you to know you're safe, Colton said. Can you feel that? Wyatt nodded. Then very quietly he said, He's warm. Yeah, Colton said. He is. Ghost's tail moved once, one slow sweep against the stone, and Wyatt smiled. A small, tentative, real smile. The smile of a boy who had just learned that the world contained at least one creature who would never raise its voice, never slam a door, never make a promise it could not keep. Colton stayed kneeling beside them for a moment longer. Then a sparkler popped somewhere behind him, closer this time, and he felt it in his spine. The flash of heat, the tightening of every muscle, the old reflex that lived deeper than thought. Ghost turned his head, not toward the sound, toward Colton. The dog leaned against Colton's leg. One press, firm, the same anchor, the same rhythm. Breathe with me, Colton breathed. 10 seconds. The flash faded. The stone bridge came back. The mountain air. The sound of children laughing. The weight of Ghost against his leg. This time was different. Not because the flashback was weaker. The difference was what came after. The return was faster. The ground was more solid. And when Colton opened his eyes, the world he came back to was not empty. Bert stood a few feet away, not intruding, just present. Silas sat on his stone across the bridge, and their eyes met, and the old man gave a single slow nod. The nod of a man who recognized what he was seeing because he had fought his own version of the same war. Colton nodded back. He was not alone. For the first time in 18 months, the thought was not a fear. It was a fact. The sun began its descent behind the western mountains, painting the valley in shades of amber and rose and the deep violet that only exists in Montana in the last minutes before the light surrenders to the stars. Colton walked to the center of the bridge. Ghost walked beside him. Their steps fell into the old rhythm, the rhythm they had kept since the beginning, the rhythm that did not need a leash or a command or a word. Just two creatures who had learned to trust the same pace. Margaret sat in her chair. Wyatt had fallen asleep against her shoulder, one hand still tangled in the blanket, the other resting on Ghost's back. The boy's face was peaceful in a way that Colton had not seen before. The face of a child who had, for the first time in his short life, spent an entire day surrounded by people who were not fighting. Margaret looked up at Colton. "Thomas used to stand right where you're standing," she said. "Every evening. He would watch the sun go down behind the mountains and tell me that the light lasted longer up here than anywhere else he had ever been." Colton looked west. The light was extraordinary. It poured through the valley like something liquid and sacred, turning the river into gold and the bridge into something that seemed less like stone and more like a promise made physical. "Dogs know the way home," Margaret said softly. "Thomas told me that once. He said dogs don't navigate by roads or maps. They navigate by belonging. They go to where they are needed, and they stay." Colton looked down at Ghost. The dog looked up at him, amber eyes steady, patient, full of something that did not have a name in any language but was understood by every creature that had ever loved without condition. "I think Ghost brought you here," Margaret said. "Not to the bridge, to us." Colton did not argue. He had stopped trying to explain what Ghost knew and how Ghost knew it. Some things were beyond the reach of reason. They lived in the space between instinct and grace, and the only proper response was gratitude. He reached into his pocket and took out his phone. The screen glowed in the fading light. He scrolled to the contact he had not called in 18 months. The name he had carried like a wound since the day he arrived in Montana. He pressed the green button. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. A voice answered. A voice Colton had not heard in so long that the sound of it hit him like a wave. "Hey," Colton said. His voice was rough, stripped down to the foundation. "It's me. I'm still here." He did not say who he was calling. He did not need to. Some calls are not about the person on the other end. They are about the person making the call finally being ready to stop disappearing. Ghost pressed against his leg. One nudge, acknowledgement. Colton stood on the bridge in the last light of the day and spoke into the phone for 3 minutes. Then he hung up and put the phone away and looked out at the valley that Thomas Harlan had given his life to protect and that Colton Mercer had somehow helped to save. The mountains stood in their ancient patience. The river flowed beneath the bridge with the sound of something that had always known this day would come. And the forest, which had kept its secrets for 45 years, seemed finally fully at rest. Colton and Ghost left the bridge as the first stars appeared above the valley. They walked the trail together in the blue dark, the dog slightly ahead, nose low, ears forward, reading the night the way he read every night with the calm certainty of a creature who knew that the world was full of things worth finding. At the bend in the trail where the path turned toward the cabin, Ghost stopped. Not the danger freeze, not the prey alert, something else entirely. The dog lifted his nose to the wind. Not the wind from the bridge, not the wind from the valley. A new wind coming from the east, carrying the smell of distance and morning and places they had never been. Ghost's ears rotated, his tail lifted, and he looked back at Colton with an expression that was not a question but an announcement. Colton studied the dog, the amber eyes, the steady body, the particular tilt of the head that meant Ghost had already made a decision and was waiting for Colton to catch up. Again, Colton said. Ghost's tail swept once across the trail. Then he turned east and took one step, just one, and waited. Colton smiled. Not the thin, reluctant smile he had worn for 18 months. A real one. The kind that starts somewhere deeper than the face and works its way out through the years of scar tissue and silence until it reaches the surface and finds against all expectation that there is still room for it. Yeah, he said, okay. He did not follow Ghost. He walked beside him, the way they had always walked. Two creatures who had lost everything except each other, moving together into whatever came next, guided not by maps or roads or the certainty that the destination would be kind, but by the simple, stubborn, unbreakable truth that neither of them would ever walk alone. Behind them, the stone bridge stood in the starlight. The river sang beneath it. Margaret Harlan's porch light burned against the dark, no longer a vigil, but a welcome. And somewhere in the mountains above Alder Ridge, the forest breathed and the wind carried the sound of it out across the valley like a blessing spoken in a language that only the trees and the river and the dogs have ever fully understood. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder or bright light. Sometimes they arrive in the patience of a man who refuses to walk away, in the loyalty of a dog who sees what the human heart cannot, and in the moment when truth, buried for decades beneath stone and silence and shame, finally finds its way back into the light. Colton Mercer came to Montana to disappear, but perhaps something larger had another plan. Because sometimes the places we stumble upon are not accidents. Sometimes they are answers, a forgotten bridge, a hidden truth, a man who stood alone to protect what was right. And 45 years later, another man and a faithful dog who arrived to finish what had been left undone. That is how it often works. Not all at once, not through one person, but through many lives connected by purpose, by courage, and by the quiet faith that goodness once planted does not die. It only waits. If this story touched your heart in any way, take a moment to share it with someone who might need a reminder that loyalty and courage still exist in this world. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Stories like this bring people together from every corner of the earth, and every voice matters. And if you believe that standing up for what is right, even when no one else will, is something worth honoring, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next story. Wherever you are today, may you find your bridge. May you find your truth. And may you always have a loyal friend walking beside you who knows the way home. Thank you for being here.